The Winter Tree by Georgina Lewis. Read by Jill Greenacre. Chapter 5. The Bough. Joseph didn't tell father, but for years afterwards the tower door was always kept securely locked. The next time we saw Joseph he was much the same as ever, but I think his increasing remoteness from us started then. Or perhaps it had started with Hester's arrival. He never came to the cottage now, or played games with us, or carried us round the orchard in the summer, or made things any more for Perrin. As a child it puzzled me briefly, and then was forgotten, like the many things that puzzled me in passing at that age. Perhaps it was simply that we were growing up. Hester never appeared to want to talk about her early years. She never spoke of them, and we never asked. She seemed to prefer it that way. I don't think there was any doubt that she'd been bitterly unhappy before coming to live with us. She kept no mementos of the time before, and had no treasures other than the old green dress which Mother had boiled thoroughly and washed for her, but she never wanted to wear it again, and it stayed neatly folded in a drawer for years afterwards. After Jackie's departure to the sky, even the birdcage was thrown away without a second glance when the dustman took it. It was as if her life had begun when she came to us. Nothing remained of the time before. She was strangely offhand about Joseph after the tower episode. To me, Joseph was part of the fabric of childhood, part of our world of home and village and church on Sundays. His father had been killed in the war, and after his mother's death the year before Thomas was born, he lived all alone in his farm cottage, with no one for company but his hens and his pipe, with that extraordinarily evocative smell of dandelion leaf tobacco. Father used to go and visit him from time to time and invite him to dinner on Mother's instructions, but he never came. When he wasn't at work on the farm, he appeared to spend most of his time in his garden, pottering about amongst tobacco leaves or in his shed, working away at making chairs and gates for the rest of the village. We walked to school along deserted lanes, knee-deep in fern and ragged robin, and returned the same way each evening. Occasionally we would pass him on his way to the fields, and he would nod briefly to us, silent and remote. At church on Sundays he was there, of course, part of the rock, the earth, of home. Years passed, and we began to grow up. It seemed a slow process at the time, but so brief now, looking back. Perrin began to grow very tall. Lissy grew plumper, and Thomas grew thinner, and even Hester filled out and lost the awkwardness of childhood. My mother would look at her sideways now and again and catch my father's eye, and even I could see she was fast becoming a beauty. She grew a little taller and lost most of her pallor, and a soft look would be there in her eyes sometimes when she was deep in thought. But there were days in the month when she would double up and clutch her stomach and look very thin and pale and be sick occasionally. And then, one Sunday, after church, David Ben Kevin asked her out. I remember how we stood, older and more dignified, in the porch after the evening service, all of us and the ringers crowding round. And some of the younger lads were climbing up on the low wall that divided the churchyard from the field, running along it and daring each other to fall. Joseph was there with us as he always was, silent in the background, watching us with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing. That evening he stood, by chance, opposite to me and directly behind Hester. From my place in the shadow of the porch I could see his face, and he did not realise I was watching him. He stood behind her, looking down at the back of Hester's slim neck. She had put her bright hair up that evening and caught it in a bunch of curls, and it left her neck oddly bare and vulnerable. She had bent her head to examine something on her hand, and was laughing a little at some remark one of the others had made, and there was Joseph behind her, looking down at the back of her neck. I think it was probably at that moment that I fully realised. There was a silence enfolding them both. Around them there was plenty of desultory conversation, banter and chatter and laughing replies, and then older George Pascoe was still organising the ringers for appeal. But Joseph and Hester were caught up in a timeless moment that was theirs alone. Then David Penkevin came over and asked Hester if she'd like to go to the cinema with him and see some film that had been much talked about. And Hester looked up at him, flushing, and said yes, she would like to, and smiled with pleasure at being asked, not giggled like Veronica Braze would have done. Hester never giggled. I think she would have been incapable of it. I knew that she'd been aware of David Penkevin for some weeks, and when he had gone, she turned to me. Her eyes shone with suppressed delight, her cheek warm with new power, and she cast me a glance of excitement. But she hadn't seen Joseph's face, and I had. Veronica caught hold of my arm and drew me aside to demand what David had asked Hester, and when I told her, her face clouded. She was younger than I was, the same age as Perrin, and pretty in a plump, pinkish sort of way. She wore rather old-fashioned clothes that her mother and grandmother had had made by a dressmaker, the family being rather well-to-do. But the dressmaker's talent was for tailored styles, the sort of thing that suited Veronica's handsome, portly mother, no doubt, but merely made poor Veronica look dowdy. I once saw her in a cotton dress, looking almost pretty. But that evening she was wearing a strange grey suit that strained across her bosom and looked as if it had been handed down from her grandmother's grandmother and made her flat feet look flatter than ever. She was desperate to impress David Penkevin, and on her wrist she wore a silver charm bracelet that she kept shaking self-consciously so that the charms jangled on their chain and her pink face grew even pinker with the effort. I glanced back at Hester, and behind her to where Joseph had stood minutes before, but he wasn't even there. Hester began to go out with David Penkevin quite regularly. It soon became an accepted fact that she and David were a couple. He took her to parties and dances and the sort of social events where Joseph would simply not have been at ease, and it was soon very obvious that David was serious about her. Then, one Christmas, we had a spell of mild, wet weather, followed by a day of cold so sharp that icicles hung from our outhouse. Ice lay in the lanes all day and glittered on the church roof at noon. The day before Christmas Eve, Hester and I were on our way up to the mound behind the village for a walk, drawing our breath in gulps so that the freezing air stung our noses and made our teeth ache with the shock. All morning my mind had been full of thoughts of Joseph, all alone in his cottage in the intense cold, so it was a relief to see him fit and well. We met him in the lane outside the church, his arms full of great piles of holly that he was taking over to the vicarage to decorate the hall for the Christmas carol party. Arms burdened, he nodded and smiled when he saw us in the lane. "For the party?" said Hester, her face bright with delight. She fingered the holly. "How lovely and waxy it looks, and the berries, happy look." As usual, she had no word of greeting for Joseph. It was as if he was not there at all, mere wood of the holly, bough of the tree. "Look, Abby, the lovely shiny leaves." "Where did you pick it, Joseph?" I asked him. "It's beautiful." "Churchfield," said Joseph briefly. He smiled at me, an indulgent smile given to a playful puppy. "There's plenty there. I'll cut you some later for yourselves if you like." "Oh, no," I said. "We couldn't put you to the trouble, Joseph. You're busy." "No trouble," he said. He looked at Hester. "Shall I cut you some, Hester?" She avoided his eyes. "No," she said lightly. "We've plenty at home." She pulled at my arm. "Come on, Abby. We're late." It seemed a curt way to take leave of him, so I lingered. "Are you going to the carol party, Joseph?" Although, of course, I knew he would. "Oh, yes," he said. "I'll be there." He always was. Hester tugged at my arm again. "Come on, Abby." She pulled away and walked up the lane. Up here on the higher ground by the church, there was a thin sprinkling of snow. Hester danced ahead, slender against the white, her boots stamping footprints in the crisp fluff. Beneath the trees, bending inward in their green gloom, she danced up the lane like a child intent on her play. She jumped up into the cold air, trying to catch hold of a bough and bring the snow down on top of us. I followed her. Turning round, I saw that Joseph was still standing there watching us. I waved and he waved back. With some haste, I caught up the dancing figure. "Poor Joseph," I said. "Oh, Hester, you were rude to him." She laughed, jumped up and grasped a low-hanging branch, bringing a shower of white down upon our heads. Her laughter rang out sharp in the clear air. "Hester," I said, "don't you care about Joseph's feelings? Listen to me." She jumped higher, missed the next branch and ran on. "Oh, Hester, stop doing that and listen to me. You're like a child." "No," she said, "I'm 16. "That's not what I meant. The way you hurt people, careless of their feelings." She stopped jumping and turned to me, serious, listening. She frowned, considering, and shook her head gravely. "I don't, Abby, I don't think so." "Well, no," I relented. "Not usually, but just now with Joseph. Poor Joseph. You hardly speak to him, Hester, ever, poor chap. You treat him as though he's not really there. Don't you care about people's feelings? Don't you care about Joseph's?" "Joseph," she said blankly. "Oh, Joseph." And then she brightened. "Race you to the gate," she said, and was off, her feet flying across the thin snow. It was a hard climb up to the top of the hill in the biting wind, but worth it when we gained the summit. Our hands stung and tingled with the exercise and the cold, and Hester's cheeks glowed pink with effort. We scrambled across the mound of ancient stones that the vicar always said had been put there at the dawn of history, even before Christ was born or the Romans came to Britain. There was a restlessness about the old hill always, so that the wind that blew there always seemed to gather up an ancient power from the very stones, and it moaned about our ears with an old lament. We could see for miles. Hester gave a long sigh. "I love it up here," she breathed. "Don't you feel like a bird, Abby, free as air, as if you could stand on one of those great stones and fly across to, France or Devon or the moon?" I looked at her, red hair below her green scarf flying about her face, cheeks flushed and eyes aglow, and laughed. "Hester, you're like a young pony let out of your stable to toss your mane in the wind." "I'd rather be a bird than a pony," she said thoughtfully, "but not in a cage. I'd like to be one of the rooks, I think." She paused. "Don't you ever feel, Abby, that to be a bird would be the most, the most real experience you could ever have?" I thought about it. "Not really. Maybe the freedom would be nice for a bit, perhaps on a warm summer afternoon just for half an hour." She laughed, and then grew serious again. "No, the bitter cold would all be part of it. Shivering in a hedge on an icy morning, breaking the ice with your beak to get a drink, pulling up worms and dying." She paused. "Dying one day of starvation in a wintry field." There was a short silence. I said lightly, "Because you couldn't find enough worms to eat or stay alive, you mean? And Joseph or Harry Tregello would come along one morning and find your poor stiff little feathered body?" The conversation had taken an odd turn, and I shivered. "No," I said, "I wouldn't like to be a bird. I'd rather stay a human being in a safe little house anchored to the ground." Hester said, "I sometimes think that to be trapped in something, unable to get away, would be worse than anything. I don't think I could bear it." "What about death?" I asked her, laughing. "You can't get out of that." "Oh, no," she said quite seriously. "Death is a kind of freedom, Abby. I mean now, trapped in a sort of prison or cage. That would be far worse." I smiled. "Then you mean like marriage?" I said, feeling witty and adult. We had lately begun to consider the state of marriage with an academic detachment and a certain distant interest. "Perhaps," said Hester vaguely. She began to walk slowly, and I followed. Although perhaps with David, marriage might be quite nice. You don't think you'd feel trapped? I asked her. We rounded a bend in the rough track, and the bitter wind caught at us unexpectedly. What if you didn't like the bed bit? What about you, Abby? She stole a sideways look at me. How would you feel sleeping with a man? Rather odd, I suppose, although if it was the right man, rather nice, I should imagine. But you wouldn't know, would you, about whether you'd feel trapped or not until you were married, and then it would be too late. I suppose that's where love comes into it, I said. If you loved the chap, I suppose you wouldn't feel trapped. How do you feel about David? She considered it for a moment. I don't think I would feel trapped with David. She bent down, frowning, then tossed a handful of snow up into the air. But I'm too young yet to think about marriage. He's very fond of you, Hester, I said. You know that, don't you? I paused. What about Joseph? She looked startled. Joseph? Yes, I said, you heard me. What about Joseph? Oh, she said quickly, turning away. Her voice had a sudden hurt tone, as if I'd said something to wound her. But all she said was, oh, Joseph. It was now or never. Hester, I asked her levelly, do you care anything at all for Joseph? She didn't answer me. Then she sighed very heavily and said, let's go home, Abby. I'm cold. I gave it up and shrugged. All right, I said, come on. We'll make toast and play dominoes by the fire if Mother doesn't need us. You know you love to play dominoes. Her face still had a tight look, but she turned back to me in a moment and nodded to herself as if she had made a decision. And then she said, very softly to herself, I shall marry David Penkevin if he asks me. And then aloud, come on, I'll race you home. We ran down the rough track, arms flying, coats flapping, boots thudding on the hard stones and crisp grass. Hester sailing down the hillside before me like one of her birds. She climbed the 5-barred gate in our path with the ease of a squirrel, brushing aside the light snow in her way, and I followed breathlessly. In a quarter of the time it had taken us to climb the hill, we were back in the lane, aching and glowing with freedom and the heady clarity of cold winter air. We turned into the lich gate to get our breath back and collapsed onto opposite sides of the low stone benches, looking triumphantly at each other. You won, I said. You always do. You know before we start who'll win. She laughed at me with sudden delight. You're too fat, Abby, or too old. Both, probably, I said, laughing back at her, although I was actually only a few months older. It was good to see her so glowing and alive with pleasure. You said toast, said Hester. She pulled off her green woolen scarf and wound it absently about her wrist. I'm hungry. She shook her head and her bright hair flew about like tongues of flame in the white air. It's dinner time by now, I said. Perhaps we'd better forget the toast. We ought to get back. Mother will wonder where we've got to. All right. She hesitated. But first we've got to do the grave. It's Saturday. I nodded. We'll have to find some stuff to put on it and get some water. Won't it freeze? I asked. She shrugged. Probably, but we must go to the grave, Abby. You understand, don't you? He won't mind if we don't, you know, Hester, I said gently. Not in the middle of winter. He won't expect flowers. I must do it, she said stubbornly. I must. I've just got to. There's holly and some laurel. The berries will show up lovely and red. All right, I said. We can get holly from the field like Joseph said. I'll run home for some laurel first, and then I'll help you cut a bit of holly. She nodded, and I left her there in the lich gate, her head glowing against the dark beams. As I ran homewards down the lane, I saw her wave at me, and then I had turned the bend, steep bank with winter growth, and she was out of sight. I cut a few small branches from a bush in the garden and shook the snow off them. Mother wandered out from the kitchen. Abby, where's Hester? Doing the grave, I answered. We won't be long. I'll lay the table when I get back. Don't worry, my love, said Mother. It's done. You're a good girl. You look after Hester. She glanced up at the sky. Looks like more snow on the way. I've got Thomas in here praying for it so he can see the garden in a snowstorm. He wants to make a drawing of it, and Perrin's talking about building a snowman. They've got some hope, they two. I chuckled, and she was gone again into the kitchen, leaving me pondering upon her words. Did Hester need looking after? I suppose she did. I shrugged it off, and waving at them through the window, ran back up the lane to find her. She had gone from the porch. I looked for her in the lane, but she was nowhere to be seen. I ran back through the gate and searched the churchyard, but there was no evidence of her. No dark green scarf or ruddy head among the stones. I went into the church, holding my bunch of laurel. There was no sign of her there either. I even tried the tower door, but as always now, since that evening 4 years ago, it was locked. I looked for a good 5 minutes before I found her, crouched on a chair behind the organ, her face in her hands. Hester, I cried in dismay. Whatever's the matter? I dropped my bunch of laurel onto the floor and knelt beside her. I longed to put my arms around her like Mother did to us when we were troubled, but she would have hated it, and then I would have been embarrassed. Hester, what is it? I shook her arm gently. Whatever's the matter? Why are you crying? Hester, answer me. She looked up suddenly from her arms, and her eyes were quite dry. Why, Hester, I said in amazement. I thought you were crying. No, she said calmly. I was listening. I could have sworn she'd been crying, but her eyes were bright, thick-lashed and luminously clear. She looked back at me, then over my shoulder into the dim height of the nave. I was listening, she said again. What were you listening to? I asked, bewildered. There was no sound in the empty church. I strained my ears to listen, but there was nothing except the light sigh of our own breathing and the siffling of snowy wind under the north door. She gave me a brief little smile and stood up. I picked up my bunch of laurel leaves and followed her, waiting for her to explain. But she said nothing at all, as if it was the most normal thing in the world to listen to silence. Perhaps for Hester it was. With a bottle of water and the laurel leaves, we made our way solemnly to the grave. It was icy cold under the trees in the still churchyard, and my fingers felt stiff and numb when I tried to flex them to unscrew the bottle top. The holly, I said. You wanted holly to go with these? I waved the laurel at her. I'll pick some, shall I? I made for the gate into the field, then looked down. There was a branch of fresh holly lying on the ground by my feet, dark against the snow, a piece that had been freshly cut that morning. That's lucky, I said. Look, Hester, there's a piece here. Joseph must have dropped it. It was long and leafy, and I picked it up, shook it, and gave it to her. She always wanted to do the grave herself. The smell of snow came across to us on the wind and filled our nostrils. It was in the air, the sky. Mother was right, there would be more before evening. I looked at Hester's bent head as she sorted out the green stems and broke them into suitable pieces for the jar. You put the water in, Abby, she said, and I did as I was told. She crouched down, and I held the jam jar while she painstakingly pushed little bits of holly and laurel into it. The water welled up and over the edge and splashed onto my fingers. I gasped with the sharp chill of it. Hester stood up to survey her work. The bunch of greenery stood out against the snow and the granite of the headstone, spears of verdant life in a still world. We gazed down at the stone. In loving memory, I read aloud, of Isaac Bartholomew, dearly beloved husband of Agnes, departed this life March the 5th, 1848, who rest us in the arms of the Lord. Hester said softly, So many years ago, Abby. Years and years before we were ever born. Is that all right? I asked her gently. Are you happy now? She nodded, absently sucking a finger. There was a thin streak of blood on her chin. "What have you done?" I asked her. "Your finger's bleeding." She looked down in surprise and squeezed it until a small red globe formed on the side. "Oh," she said, "I must have pricked it on the holly. It's nothing." She rubbed at the side of the wound and held up the shimmering ruby drop for me to see. "Look, Abby." She carefully transferred the shining globe onto a single holly leaf. "Now there's another berry on Joseph's holly, a berry of Hester's blood." It was an extraordinary thing to say. For a moment I felt quite dizzy, as if strands of mist had caught together out of the very air and were swirling about, drifting white and low. I looked up at her and realised the strands were snow, huge leafy flakes falling swiftly out of a massive sky. She looked back at me through the falling flakes, across the faceless unknown grandfather's grave, so calmly, like a figure in a dream, and she said again, "A berry of Hester's blood." Then she turned and ran lightly away, disappearing soundlessly on the snow-muffled ground into the arch of trees.